nerds, what's up? Today I'm going to talk about giving The Witcher a second chance. See you after the jump. So a few months ago, I made a super popular video about how I thought the book The Last Wish was sexist. Okay, so I'm being a little facetious, but despite the fact that I stand by that opinion in that video, I was a very new booktuber and I still am, and I made a lot of mistakes. The first being that I didn't bring enough receipts. I had read The Last Wish months before I made that video and didn't really have all of the quotes and direct references to back it up, even though I believe what I said was true. So today I brought receipts. I made sure that I really focused on what I wanted to get across. I also noticed there was just a lot of misconceptions about that video, and I want to clear them up today. So today we're going to talk about the Sword of Destiny, whether I liked it more than The Last Wish. We're going to clear up some misconceptions from the last video. We're going to talk about sexism and talk about why you should even care about the stuff I'm talking about in The Witcher. Now, I've put a lot of chapters in the info box below, so if there are certain topics about this video that interest you, you can go check that out there and kind of jump around, because this will be a long video because I do have a lot to talk about and a lot to clear up, and there's a lot of nuance to this conversation. Now, if you're just here to see whether or not I liked the Sword of Destiny better than The Last Wish, the answer is yes, and I'm going to go into it later, but I technically liked this 3 times more than The Last Wish based on my star rating, and I particularly loved the short stories at the end. So I'm gonna go into that. I did like it better, but there were still problems, and I'm gonna talk about them today. We're gonna start out with some misconceptions, and this first one is so important, and I wanna start off with it right away. I do not think you are sexist if you like The Witcher. So many people in my comments in my last video got extremely defensive about themselves personally, and I think they took my video wrong and that I was somehow saying that everyone who likes The Witcher is sexist. No, I would never make that claim. I do not believe that at all. And I just want to clear that up so when you're defending the book, you don't feel like you have to defend yourself. I would never make claims like that about a whole fan base. I certainly like books that I know have problematic elements in them, and I would hate if someone made that assumption about me. So this is nothing about you as a person. This is just about what I found in the book and my opinion of the book. I do want to quickly thank all of the people in my comment section of the last video who disagreed with me but weren't hostile, because you were the ones who convinced me to give The Witcher another try, and I think that's really cool that you were able to disagree with me without calling me names, if we're gonna be honest. Another thing I realized a lot of people were really confused about in my last video is what I meant by sexism. A lot of the comments thought I meant sex scenes, which really had nothing to do with it. And I realized I never defined what I meant about sexism. So I want to start off this video right away and talk about what do I mean when I say The Last Wish is sexist, or I say The Witcher is sexist. So sexism in the broadest sense usually means discrimination against a gender, but generally when we talk about sexism, we talk about discrimination against women. Now in books, this can take many forms. It might be that women just aren't really present in the story. It might be that women have no defining traits outside of men. They don't have their own motivations, or they're portrayed with very typical stereotypes as like the damsel in distress or what have you. Also objectification. Now, The Last Wish struggled with a few of these, but I feel like the Sword of Destiny only struggled with one of them, and it was the thing that The Last Wish also struggled the most from. So today, when I talk about sexism, I'm talking about one very specific type of sexism, which is objectification. Objectification, simply put, is viewing women as objects. It means we view their bodies as the most important part of them, as the first thing we notice, that women aren't anything more than what their body can do for us. This will be my focus today. Let's start off talking about the Sword of Destiny. Now, I'm first just gonna read off all of the ways that women were objectified in this novel. And the broadest way I can start is to say that every single speaking female character's breasts were described. I actually have the receipts for that. I marked when a speaking female character entered, and then I marked after when her breasts were described. That's like a very simple sign of objectification, that their bodies always have to be described in detail, specifically when men's bodies aren't described in the same way. Honestly, it was pretty hilarious and I laughed a lot because it was such a predictable pattern. Now, this pattern actually kept up until the last 2 stories, The Sword of Destiny and Something More. So I'm gonna be focusing on the first 4 or 5 mini stories, and we're gonna talk about those last 2 stories separately because they're a whole different thing altogether. Now, before I jump into reading these quotes, I need to set up that I am just setting up my evidence. I'm just going to be reading quotes and telling you about them and kind of what I thought about them. and then giving defenses for them later. A lot of you guys put a lot of defenses of The Last Wish in my last video, and I am gonna argue your side. I'm gonna talk about those defenses, but the main problem with my last video is I just didn't have enough evidence. I didn't have the receipts. So I'm gonna start off by reading direct quotes from many parts of this book so I can set up what I'm talking about and give you a better idea of what I noticed in the book. So we're gonna jump into it. We start off in the first story really strong, right on the first page, with a man claiming he owns 2 women. Now, I didn't judge this right off the bat. Maybe he does own these women, but it was just like a little suspicious. And as this continues, these women who don't know Geralt at all make suggestive comments at him all night and suggestive winks and very sexual comment toward him, and they're very just like sexual beings. And this culminates to when 3 Jackdaws, the man who owns them, offers them to Geralt for him to choose which one he wants sex with without like any consultation of the women. "I know it's difficult to choose," said 3 Jackdaws, understandingly. "I occasionally have difficulty myself. Never mind, we'll give it some thought in the tub. Hey girls, help me up the stairs." So in that quote, 3 Jackdaws is telling the Witcher that you might have a hard time choosing which one you want to bed. Don't worry, you can choose later when we're in this hot tub. Again, women are property, women don't have a say, you get to choose. This sort of scene is usually a very typical male wish fulfillment about women who immediately want men, women who don't mind being chosen by 2 different men and have no say or thought into these actions by themselves. This is problematic, and we're gonna talk about it more later. Next, we meet Yennefer, and I have so much to talk about when it comes to Yennefer that I've made my own section on her, and we're gonna just move the discussion about Yennefer as a person to a little bit later when it fits more into our conversation. But we are gonna start with a story of something that happens to Yennefer that I personally feel is completely unnecessary. So our heroes get trapped. They are betrayed and tied to a wagon. It's obviously a very bad situation. We know these people aren't very good, and this is what transpires. "Well, Yennefer," Boholt said as he walked over, "how do you plan to turn me into a gelding now, when you can't move a hand?" He tore at the collar of her coat and then ripped and wrenched open her blouse. Yennefer shrieked, choked by the reins. "I don't have the time now," Boholt said, groping her shamelessly to the cackling of the dwarves. "But wait a little while, witch. Once we've sorted out the dragon, we'll make merry. Tie her firmly to the wheel, boys, both little hands to the rim so she won't be able to lift a finger. And no one's to bloody touch her yet, my lords. We'll sort the order out depending on who does a good job on the dragon." You can make all sorts of arguments about this scene, about how it's necessary to show how bad the dwarves are or show how bad the world is, but it just doesn't really seem to track for me. The scene doesn't add. I don't feel like I know anything more about the dwarves after they expose Yennefer and then talk about gang raping her. It's, again, just another way to make the women seem helpless without any sort of thing with the men and just an objectifying scene in general. And after this, we have Dandelion, one of our good guys, just like ogling Yennefer the entire time. She repeatedly tells him to stop. Geralt listens immediately and turns away, and Dandelion doesn't. Now, I try not to judge Dandelion too much because at least he's a character choice. Dandelion's this typical bard that we always talk about even in Dungeons & Dragons, like he's philandering, he's a womanizer. So even though it's annoying that this character is there, I forgive it a little bit because at least it's a character choice. But it's important that we note here that Geralt looks away. He is set up as the good guy who is listening to Yennefer. Moving on, Geralt goes to a bathhouse and says he was annoyed by the fact that the attendant did not offer him a whore. He had no intention of availing himself of one, but in bathhouses, everybody was offered them, so he was annoyed by the exception being made for him. Again, you can make a claim that it's just showing how bad the world is, but it's another example of women being used to do that, whores being just offered to men. A few scenes later, Dandelion's jilted lover is introduced, and we have this line. "Take those rags," the blonde woman screamed, the frills on her plump breasts swaying gracefully, "and get out of my sight. Don't set foot here again." Again, another woman who's a speaking part, immediately her breasts are described for really no purpose. Sometimes I also forget that non-speaking female characters also get their boobs described. The dwarf's face bore an expression of visible dislike. To be precise, he looked as though any moment he intended to spit on the female customer sifting through the goods. The customer's breast was heaving. She was shaking her golden curls and besetting the dwarf with a ceaseless and chaotic flow of words. Dandelion's jilted lover comes back very briefly, and we get this description. From behind a stall emerged Vespula, her breast heaving violently, raking him up with a foreboding gaze. Next, we move on to the short story A Little Sacrifice, and this is the story I had the most problems with. There's a lot of objectification here, and a lot of the most damaging views, I think, are held in this one. It starts off immediately with a mermaid who is obviously naked. I know that you can make that claim. Again, that's normal. They're normally naked. But again, I just think a lot of the descriptions for her are very unnecessary. I'm actually not even going to read the full description because I try to keep this a somewhat friendly, family-friendly channel, and it would not be that way if I read the whole description, so we're just going to read a little bit of it. The mermaid emerged to waist height from the water and splashed her hands violently and hard against the surface. Geralt saw that she had gorgeous, utterly perfect breasts. Again, this is the first sentence of the new story, the first time we're ever meeting this mermaid. Later, she turns on her back and reveals her attributes in all of their glory. At first, during the story, I'm very excited when Little Eye, or Essie, gets introduced. She seems like a very interesting character. I'm interested with her relationship with Dandelion, which is just on a friendship basis, and I think she's going to be a cool character. Her breasts do get described later, but at least it took a few pages before that happened, and we'll talk about that. But I think what comes up next is one of the most problematic scenes in the book, in my opinion. And to set it up a little bit, Geralt has just met Essie. This is the first night. They've probably spent an hour together by my estimation, and not really even together. She's a bard as well and is performing along with Dandelion at a wedding. And they walk out onto a balcony together, and this scene ensues. It happened suddenly, utterly unexpectedly. The movement he made, which was supposed to have just been a gentle touch of her arms, turned into a powerful grasp of both hands around her very slender waist, into a rapid, though not rough, pulling of her closer, and into a sudden, passionate contact of their bodies. Essie stiffened suddenly, straightened, bent her torso powerfully backwards, pressed her hands down on his firmly as though she wanted to pull away and push his hands from her waist, but instead of that, she seized them tightly, tipped her head forward, parted her lips, and hesitated. Why this, she whispered. Her eyes were wide open, her golden curl had fallen onto her cheek. Calmly and slowly, he tipped his head forward, brought his face closer, and suddenly and quickly pursed his lips into a kiss. Essie, however, even then, did not release his hands grasping her waist and still powerfully arched her back, avoiding bodily contact. Remaining like that, they turned around slowly as though in a dance. She kissed him eagerly, expertly, for a long time. Then she nimbly and effortlessly freed herself from his embrace, turned away, once again leaned on the railing, and drew her head into her shoulders. Geralt suddenly felt dreadfully, indescribably stupid. The feeling stopped him from approaching her, from putting an arm around her hunched back. Why, she asked coolly without turning around, why did you do that? She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, and the Witcher suddenly understood he had made a mistake. He suddenly knew that insincerity, lies, pretense, and bravado would lead him straight into a swamp, where only a springy, matted layer of grass and moss, liable to yield, tear or break at any moment, separated him from the abyss below. Why, she repeated. He did not answer. Are you looking for a woman for the night? Don't make that face, Essie said. It was nothing, and the fact that I'm not looking for a man for tonight isn't your fault, is it? This scene is so bad on so many levels. The author says multiple times that Essie is tense, that Essie is physically pushing her body away from the Witcher. She does not want this contact. She says she doesn't want to be with anybody for the night. She's giving every cue, and then after, the Witcher's just allowed to say, oops, that was stupid, and Essie basically says, oh, no big deal, it's fine. And what comes later is even worse, but just in this scene, it was so frustrating to read something that is saying, well, no didn't really mean no. I can ignore the warning signs when a woman is physically leaning away, is physically tense, and verbally says she didn't want something, but that's okay to ignore. What makes this scene worse is what happens directly after. At first, it seems like it's going in a good direction. That night, Geralt and Dandelion have this talk, and Dandelion is like, why did you think you could have her? Just because you're a Witcher and you thought she'd be interested in you? Like, that doesn't mean anything. And I was like, oh, this is actually okay. Like, I feel like maybe this is going in a better direction. But just kidding, Essie is actually deeply, madly in love with Geralt. Yes, I love you, Geralt. I don't care what you think. I've loved you from the moment I saw you at that engagement party. Now, they've known each other a total, I think, of 2 days at this point, and she waxes on about how much she loves Geralt for like 2 pages. Now, she thinks she's bewitched, but she's actually not. And it just doesn't track at all with like this previous interaction. It doesn't make any sense. And the best part about this scene is that Geralt tries to convince himself to have pity sex with her to make her feel better. And I feel like you don't believe me, but I'm gonna read the scenes to kind of give you an idea of what's going on. "I know," she groaned again. "I know I ought to be grateful to you for not taking advantage of the situation, but I'm not grateful to you, and I'm ashamed of it." And then she pressed herself to him firmly, burying her head in his chest. A little sacrifice, he thought, just a little sacrifice. For this will calm her, a hug, a kiss, calm caress. She doesn't want anything more, and even if she did, what of it? For a little sacrifice, a very little sacrifice, is beautiful and worth. Were she to want more, it would calm her, a quiet, calm, gentle act of love. He can't sacrifice sleeping with Essie because he's in love with Yennefer. It's funny. Like this whole scene about I can't give myself pity sex to this woman who's known me barely at all and is madly in love with me because I'm in love with another woman. It's just objectifying. And we're going to talk more about that later. And then a couple pages later, or maybe it was before, is when we get the boob description of Little Eye because she compares her charms to the mermaid's charms. The end of the story is also really bizarre, where this mermaid makes this huge love sacrifice for her man, but it doesn't make sense in the context of the story because nothing was sacrificed to her. But that's a whole nother topic, and so I'm not going to get into it here. But I do want to let you know that just to make sure that every scene mentions her boobs, even when she's clothed in this scene. I don't feel like reading all of these, but it's on page 240 if you don't believe me. The first thing we talk about is her boobs, and this time they're covered, so. Anyway, I wish I was also making up the other ending of this story, but I'm not. Essie and Geralt do have sex. Dandelion gets really mad at them for being all morose, and this scene ensues. We start with Dandelion speaking. "I've had enough. By the gods, I'm up to here with you, up to here. Very well, listen. I'm going to break myself off a hazel rod and go fishing, and you will have some time to yourselves. You'll be able to tell each other everything. Tell each other everything, try to understand each other. It is not as difficult as you think. And after that, by the gods, do it. Do it with him, Poppet. Do it with her, Geralt, and be good to her. And then you'll either bloody get over it, or..." Dandelion turned around rapidly and walked away, breaking reeds and cursing. He made a rod from a hazel branch and horsehair and fished until dusk fell. After he walked off, Geralt and Essie stood for a long time, leaning against a misshapen willow tree bent over the water. They stood holding hands. Then the Witcher spoke softly for a long time, and Little Eye was full of tears. And then by the gods they did it, she and he, and everything was all right. Yep. So yeah, she acts like she doesn't want to be with him physically by saying no and leaning away and tensing her body multiple times. But nope, that wasn't really the case. Her no didn't actually mean anything because she was actually in love with Geralt, and then he gives her pity sex and everything's okay. And I forgot the best part of this story is that she literally dies after this. They have this thing about how 4 years later she dies of some sort of pox or something. So like, her story in this is to be ignored, but be secretly in love with Geralt, have him have pity sex with her, and then she dies after. Okay, so that clearly finishes the most problematic story in the whole book. Now here's where it gets really weird. The next two stories, which are also the last two stories, The Sword of Destiny and Something More, have nothing sexist in them. It is the most bizarre thing. Like, it was written by a different author, and there are so many opportunities. In The Sword of Destiny, we go to a whole community of dryads that are just women, and it's so bizarre that none of the women's bodies are described. In fact, this almost makes it more of an argument for me that clearly either the author or translator is sexist, because it's not obviously a character choice, because all of a sudden Geralt has this turnaround, and it's also where we get to meet Ciri. And these two stories are incredible. It made me so frustrated about the rest of this book because I was so into the stories. I was so into the characters. I love Ciri. I love that, I think it's Calanth, I'm going to say that wrong, but the queen isn't sexualized in this book, even though she was in The Last Wish. It's all so good, and it's about destiny, and there's this awesome scene at this gravesite with Yennefer's name, and like, the whole thing is so good. It made me understand why people are fans of The Witcher because it was so good. Okay. Before we go on to talk about those sexist scenes I just described and really go in depth about why they're objectifying and why it matters, I have to talk about Yennefer. Now, y'all, I stand by what I said about Yennefer in my last video. I'm gonna make a claim here. I don't think you all remember what Yennefer was like in The Last Wish. I think you only remember Yennefer, Sword of Destiny on, I'm assuming, because in The Last Wish is a different Yennefer, or we don't know enough about her than what she is presented in The Sword of Destiny. In The Sword of Destiny, Yennefer feels like a completely different character, and I love her. She's fully fleshed out. She's definitely a character with her own motivations, her own sense of where she wants to be. She's not pushed around by anyone else, and she is a wonderful character. But she is not like that in The Last Wish, and I will stand by that. She is such a different person in The Sword of Destiny. And I also want to tell you guys that, like, the scenes between Geralt and Yennefer aren't sexist. If you notice that I didn't talk about them, even though he's describing her body and they have sex scenes. Why isn't it sexist? Because they're in a relationship. It's so mutual. Like, clearly Geralt is attracted to Yennefer and it's a choice. Like, those things aren't what makes it sexist. What makes a book objectifying is when every female character, regardless of their plot in the story, is described in a sexual manner. Like, that's what's sexist. What's not sexist is Geralt loving Yennefer, right? Because that's a story. There's a purpose behind that, and that's the subtle difference here. Okay, so let's get into the defenses. I'm going to talk about the common defenses I got in my last video on The Witcher, and I think a lot of them apply to The Sword of Destiny, so we're going to go over them. The first one I got a lot is you have to take into account the time period this was written in. Things were a lot more sexist a long time ago, so you have to give it a chance. Guys, this was written in the 90s. I just don't know if my YouTube audience is really young, but the 90s are very recent. I lived through the entire 90s, okay? 90s weren't a long time ago. If this was written in the 50s or 60s, I'd give you some credit. I'm sorry, I'm not gonna give you credit for the 90s. The second most common defense I got were, well, medieval societies were sexist. A lot of fantasy takes place in medieval societies, so sexism exists in those stories. Now, I'm gonna debunk this. While it's true that medieval societies were sexist and our society today is still sexist, and so it makes sense that some of these elements may come up in our fantasies that are very rooted in those past worlds. The problem is that there's a difference between a book that is sexist and a book that has a sexist society. The two books that come to mind are The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu and The Winds of Strife, which was that self-published novel I recently reviewed on my channel. And in both of those stories, they have a sexist society, but the books themselves aren't sexist at all. They clearly differentiate between the society that is sexist and the language they use to describe women. It's very clear that it's not the author's views. Now, this isn't a super great one-to-one comparison because both The Winds of Strife and The Grace of Kings have multiple viewpoints. And multiple viewpoints really help hit home the difference between a sexist author and a sexist society. But the one reason I'm not going to let The Witcher off the hook is that The Witcher makes a lot of commentary about the definition of who are the real monsters and the kind of like racism in society of who is considered lower class and who is upper class, and is there really any differences between who these people we consider monsters and ourselves. And it makes this point so clear that I feel like it would be really easy to make the same kind of commentary on sexism if the author was intending this world to be sexist. And that, I think, is the biggest reason it's obvious that the author doesn't even realize they're being objectifying to women, because they don't make any commentary about it when there's plenty of commentary in the book about other social issues. And look, I'm not pretending this is a real argument, but I just have to bring this one thing up. We have all of these fantasy books with dragons and wizards and witches and magic and mermaids and all of these fantastical elements. And we can't imagine a medieval society that isn't sexist because that's too hard to imagine. Adjacent to this, people also made the claim the author isn't sexist, The Witcher isn't sexist, but Geralt as a character is sexist. He's like the James Bond of this world. Okay, here's the thing about this argument. I kind of have a problem with it either way, whether it's Geralt or the author, but I don't really buy it that it's just Geralt, and here's why. Most of the time, the objectification is happening in this novel. It really sounds more omniscient, like from a narrator, than it seems to come from Geralt. Additionally, we have Dandelion, who's like over the top, objectifying, and it's pretty clear we're supposed to at least laugh at that or not really think it's normal or great. And so it feels like the author's saying that, but everything else is okay, or else there would be commentary on it. Additionally, Geralt is very clearly the hero of this novel. I don't really agree when people say we're supposed to hate all the characters in here. Geralt feels like a hero. He feels like someone we're supposed to be rooting for. And additionally, like whenever I'm on Reddit, he's mentioned so much as like a character people just love. He's always mentioned of like people I'd want on my side, people I'd want with me. And that's great. I get it. Geralt is awesome. Like unobjectively, he's awesome when you read this novel. But the problem is that he's very glamorized. He's like the cool guy, and he also objectifies women a lot, and that's just not talked about. So if it's not talked about, how can we know that his viewpoint isn't good if we consider him the hero. Okay, so this brings us to our last subject of this video, which is, why does this matter? Who cares? Okay, so Geralt's a little sexist. The Last Wish in The Witcher is a little sexist. Who cares? It's just a story. Why does it matter? Why are you talking about this? It matters because what we consume influences behavior. Now, I can't offer you concrete numbers on this. There are a lot of studies who've tried to nail down what it means for readers or consumers of media and how it affects our behavior. And honestly, as someone who had to study a lot of statistics as a part of my graduate degree, I'm not here to bring you crappy data just to support my opinion. And I really mean that. These research studies that you've probably seen floating around a lot, they're not good. They're not good for several reasons. One, they mostly focus on small groups like university students who just aren't really representative of the world as a whole. They have a lot of things like they tend to be wealthier, they tend to be more liberal, they tend to be less religious, and all sorts of things that make them different from maybe the larger set of the world. Additionally, it's really hard when you study things like this because it mostly relies on things like surveys where people will lie to make themselves sound better. They will lie about how much they read, they will lie about how open-minded they are, they will lie about their opinions to make themselves look better. All in all, this makes this data very difficult to nail down and very hard to just put in a study. However, I think we can all agree, and I think it's pretty hard to argue, that the media we consume influences us in some way. And I'm not saying that one-to-one correlation, like they used to say, you play a violent video game and you're gonna go kill someone, or like you play Dungeons and Dragons and you're gonna worship demons, okay? That stuff has been going on, and I'm not talking about that one-to-one correlation. I'm talking about what we consume does influence us in some way. It influences our behaviors, it influences our outlook on the world. And this comes to the biggest problem I had with some of the things in my comment section from last video, which is people who try to say it doesn't matter that The Witcher objectifies women because that isn't happening anymore. If you think this isn't happening anymore, you haven't talked to your female friends or your wives or your mothers or anyone in your life. It's still happening. I'm gonna just completely ignore the sexist things that have happened to me in my professional life and in my university life and sort of like glass ceiling things that have happened to me because that's not what we're talking about here. I'm gonna focus on just like basic objectification stories about the man who followed me around a grocery store when I had my toddler with me and even followed me into a parking lot. I'm talking about the time I was followed down a street, the times that I can't even count being shouted out of a car window, the time a complete stranger walked up to me in my university cafeteria and commented on my chest when I was wearing a t-shirt. The time when I was working a summer job when I had just newly turned 18 as a cashier at a grocery store, and a man who was 50 years old came through my line and asked me out for drinks, and when I politely declined, became aggressive with me. These stories are small and don't even encompass all the things that have happened to me and don't even touch the surface of some of the more serious things that have happened to my female friends and acquaintances and relatives. At the very least, these experiences are annoying and stupid, but at the worst, they can be terrifying and feel life-threatening in the moment. And so the thing that made me the angriest was in my comments when commenters tried to gaslight me and tell me that I was wrong, that these experiences weren't what they were, that it was just because you misunderstood them, they were just awkward men trying to flirt, even going as so far as to say they might have just been autistic and it wasn't their fault that you felt uncomfortable. The pervasive opinion that it is my job as a woman to understand a man who was following me around a grocery store and making me feel unsafe when I have verbally said I did not want that is the problem I have with the objectification in The Witcher. It is the problem I have with a woman in a story verbally saying no and leaning away, and then after actually being in love with Geralt. It is saying no doesn't mean no. When a woman is saying no and telling you she feels uncomfortable, it is on her and not on the man. The problem is this is an opinion out there that exists. And it's not just about media, it's about a lot of things. It's about how you grew up, who your examples are, what town you lived in, what university. There's so many things that go into who we are and our opinions, but media is one of them. And the fact is the opinion out there exists that objectifying women either isn't a big deal or it doesn't exist today when it does. And I know all the readers of The Witcher aren't like that. I know that. I said it in the beginning. So why do I talk about it? Because it's just important to recognize. It's important to recognize that the way the women are written in here isn't okay. And if you can recognize that, then it's great. And I want to bring attention to it so that other readers can recognize that that isn't okay. And then maybe that kind of objectification in real life can stop, because even if we see it in media, we can know that that's not an appropriate way to act. That's not a way a hero acts. And even further, the readers of today, the fantasy readers of today, often become the fantasy writers of tomorrow. And if I can point out to you the problematic ways that women are written as objects to be consumed and not to be their own people, that the writers of tomorrow will get to use that and make better female characters, or at least make intentional choices about their sexism in a way that doesn't objectify women, even if their society is sexist. Do I want you to hate The Witcher? No, I don't. I already told you I loved the last 2 stories of The Witcher. I thought they were really well written and I loved the characters. I want you to keep loving this book. I just want you to recognize the problems with it. I want you to recognize how it truly does objectify women, and understanding that will help you to see it in other places where it may matter more. So what are my final thoughts on The Witcher? The Sword of Destiny was less sexist than The Last Wish. I felt like The Last Wish suffered from none of the female characters having their own motivations. The Sword of Destiny didn't suffer from that, but it did still suffer from a lot of objectification. The interesting thing is I would probably tell people to skip The Last Wish. I didn't feel like I learned anything important in there that I needed to know for the Sword of Destiny. Maybe a little bit of that firstborn thing, but I think The Witcher does a pretty good job of catching you up on what you need to know. And I would start with The Sword of Destiny because I did enjoy it a lot more, particularly the last 2 stories. Now, if I had someone who could be like, hey, I thought The Last Wish was really sexist and The Sword of Destiny, but guess what? The rest of the series is just like those last 2 short stories and you never see it again, or it's very slight, I'd honestly keep reading The Witcher. I really loved Ciri. I loved their whole storyline, but I'm just tired. I'm exhausted of reading the interpretation. Whether or not it's the author or the translator, I'm tired of reading it. So if someone can tell me that's not gonna happen again, I would continue. I think it's a cool story. I love the lore, and I like The Witcher, and I like Ciri, and I like a lot of the characters. But for now, I'm probably gonna be cautious and not continue reading this series just because of the problems that I've outlined with it. Now, whether or not you liked the conclusions I came to in this video, if you want to see more thoughtful book content where I do a lot of deep dives, then please like and subscribe to this video to show your support. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye. Okay guys, I usually don't defend myself on name pronunciations, okay? I know I do it terribly wrong. This is the joke of the channel, right? I can't get it right. But so many people were mad at me for calling Geralt Geralt in the last video, and I just want to make the statement that in the English language, this name is pronounced Gerald. So I don't think it's a super far reach that I thought if you just changed it to T, it would be Geralt. I just want to defend myself there because I don't think it's that crazy. But I fixed it for this video and I called him Geralt for all you guys. You're welcome.